Picture this. You are standing in the courtyard of a medieval castle, and the year is 1452. The morning mist clings to the stone walls like whispers of the dead, and you can hear something that makes your blood freeze in your veins. It's the sound of metal scraping against stone, followed by a woman's desperate sobbing that echoes from somewhere deep within the castle walls. You're not supposed to be here. You're just a servant, tasked with delivering fresh linens to the guest quarters. But curiosity has always been your weakness, and the sounds are coming from a part of the castle you've never seen before. As you creep closer to the source of the noise, you discover a narrow staircase leading down into the bowels of the fortress. The stone steps are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the air grows colder with each step you descend. At the bottom, you find yourself in a dimly lit chamber that looks more like a dungeon than anything else. But what you see there will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. Suspended from the ceiling are three iron cages, each barely large enough to hold a grown person. Inside each cage is a young woman, beautiful despite her obvious suffering, dressed in what were once fine gowns, now reduced to tatters. Their faces are gaunt from hunger, their eyes hollow with despair, and their hands clutch desperately at the iron bars. These are not prisoners of war or common criminals. These are noble ladies, daughters of powerful families, and they are here for one horrifying reason. They are being tested as potential brides for the lord of this castle. Welcome to the twisted world of medieval marriage politics, where love was a luxury few could afford, and matrimony was a battlefield where human lives were sacrificed for political gain. Before diving into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The man responsible for this grotesque spectacle was Vlad Dracul II, not to be confused with his more famous son, who would later become known as Vlad the Impaler. But in many ways, the father's cruelty toward women was even more systematic and psychologically devastating than his son's battlefield brutality. Vlad Dracul ruled over Wallachia, a region that served as a buffer between the expanding Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe, during one of the most turbulent periods in medieval history. This was a time when marriage alliances could determine the fate of entire kingdoms, when a single wedding could shift the balance of power across continents, and when young women were treated as nothing more than political chess pieces to be moved around the board at will. But what made Vlad Dracul unique among medieval rulers was his bizarre obsession with testing the character of potential brides through systematic starvation and psychological torture. The castle where these horrors took place was Poenari Castle, perched high on a cliff overlooking the Arges River. From the outside, it appeared to be a typical medieval fortress with thick stone walls, imposing towers, and all the defensive features necessary to withstand a siege. But hidden within its depths were chambers specifically designed for Vlad's twisted matrimonial experiments. These weren't dungeons meant for holding prisoners of war. They were laboratories of human suffering, carefully constructed to break the spirits of young women while keeping them alive long enough to serve his purposes. The process began with what appeared to be normal diplomatic negotiations. Vlad's agents would approach the families of eligible young women, offering generous dowries and promising advantageous political alliances. The families, eager to secure their daughters' futures and strengthen their own positions, would readily agree to these seemingly beneficial arrangements. They had no idea they were essentially selling their daughters into a nightmare that would make death seem like a mercy. When the young women arrived at Poenari Castle, they were initially treated with all the courtesy due to their noble birth. They were given comfortable quarters, fine clothing, and elaborate meals. They were told that the marriage negotiations were proceeding well and that they would soon meet their future husband. For perhaps a week or two, everything seemed perfectly normal. The castle staff was polite and attentive, the accommodations were luxurious, and the future looked bright. But then came the first test, and this is where Vlad's true nature revealed itself. Without warning, the young women would be seized by guards and dragged down to the underground chambers. There, they would be locked inside iron cages barely large enough to allow them to stand or lie down. The cages were suspended from the ceiling, making it impossible for the prisoners to touch the ground or gain any leverage to escape. Most disturbing of all, the cages were positioned so that the women could see each other, forcing them to watch their fellow prisoners slowly waste away. The stated purpose of this imprisonment was to test their character under extreme duress. Vlad claimed he needed to know whether a potential wife possessed the strength and dignity necessary to stand beside him, as he ruled over a kingdom constantly under threat. He wanted to see how they would react to hunger, fear, and despair. Would they maintain their composure, or would they break down and reveal themselves to be weak and unworthy of royal marriage? But the reality was far more sinister than any test of character. Vlad was a sadist who derived pleasure from watching beautiful, privileged young women reduced to desperate, starving creatures begging for mercy. The cages weren't just prison cells, they were viewing boxes designed to provide him with entertainment during his leisure hours. He would often bring guests down to observe his collection, pointing out the various stages of physical and psychological deterioration as if he were showing off prized livestock. The women were fed just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to satisfy their hunger. A piece of moldy bread here, a cup of dirty water there, perhaps a few scraps of meat if they pleased their captor in some way. The portions were calculated with scientific precision to maintain their health, while maximizing their suffering. Vlad had consulted with physicians to determine exactly how little food a human being could survive on for extended periods. The psychological torture was even more carefully orchestrated than the physical deprivation. The women were told that their release depended entirely on their behavior during the test. If they could demonstrate sufficient patience, dignity, and submission, they would be freed and married with great ceremony. If they failed the test by complaining, weeping, or showing signs of weakness, they would remain in the cages until they learned proper comportment. This created a cruel paradox that pushed many of the women to the brink of madness. They were starving and suffering, which naturally caused them to cry out for help or express their anguish. But any expression of distress was interpreted as failure, which extended their imprisonment and increased their suffering. They were trapped in a situation where their natural human responses to torture were used as justification for more torture. Some women tried to maintain their dignity by remaining silent, enduring their suffering without complaint in the hope that their stoicism would earn their release. Others attempted to win Vlad's favor through flattery and submission, praising his wisdom and begging for the honor of becoming his bride. A few tried to escape by working loose the bars of their cages or attempting to pick the locks, though the suspended position made such efforts nearly impossible. But perhaps the most heartbreaking response was when the women tried to support each other. Despite their own desperate circumstances, they would whisper words of encouragement to their fellow prisoners, share whatever meager scraps of food they received, and try to maintain each other's spirits through prayer and conversation. These acts of compassion and solidarity were exactly the opposite of what Vlad wanted to see. He preferred competition and conflict among his prisoners, as it provided him with more interesting entertainment. The castle staff who witnessed these horrors were sworn to absolute secrecy under penalty of death. Most were too terrified to speak about what they saw, but a few left behind written accounts that survived in monastery archives for centuries. These documents provide chilling details about the daily routines of torture that took place in the underground chambers. Servants were required to clean the cages regularly, removing waste and scrubbing away blood from where the women had injured themselves trying to escape. Other staff members were assigned to monitor the prisoner's health, reporting any signs of serious illness or impending death to Vlad personally. He wanted to be informed immediately if any of his test subjects were in danger of dying, not out of compassion but because dead prisoners were useless to him. The goal was to bring them as close to death as possible without actually killing them, maintaining them in a state of perpetual suffering that would reveal their true character. The families of these women, meanwhile, had no idea what was happening to their daughters. They received regular messages from Vlad's court assuring them that the marriage negotiations were proceeding well and that their daughters were being treated with all appropriate honor. Some families even received forged letters supposedly written by their daughters, describing their comfortable life at the castle and expressing enthusiasm for their upcoming weddings. These deceptions were necessary because Vlad needed to maintain his reputation as a legitimate ruler worthy of diplomatic relationships. If word spread that he was torturing the daughters of noble families, he would quickly find himself isolated and vulnerable to attack by his enemies. The facade of normal courtship and marriage negotiations had to be maintained at all costs, even as the reality beneath the castle was something out of a nightmare. The testing period could last anywhere from several weeks to many months, depending on Vlad's mood and the level of entertainment he derived from particular prisoners. Some women endured their ordeal for half a year or more before finally being released, while others were deemed failures much more quickly. The criteria for success or failure seemed to change arbitrarily, suggesting that the tests were less about evaluating character and more about satisfying Vlad's sadistic impulses. Those who survived the testing phase faced an uncertain future that was hardly better than their imprisonment. Some were indeed married to Vlad in elaborate ceremonies that served to legitimize his rule and strengthen political alliances. But marriage to such a man was its own form of torture, involving continued psychological abuse, isolation from family and friends, and the constant threat of violence. Others were released but sent back to their families as damaged goods, their reputations ruined, and their prospects for future marriage destroyed. The most tragic cases were those who simply disappeared. Some prisoners who failed to meet Vlad's standards were quietly executed and buried in unmarked graves within the castle grounds. Others were sold into slavery or given as gifts to allied rulers who shared Vlad's taste for cruelty. A few were driven completely insane by their experiences and spent the rest of their lives in monasteries or asylums, unable to function in normal society. The psychological mechanisms that Vlad employed to break these women were sophisticated beyond what most people of his era understood about human nature. He had studied the writings of ancient philosophers and consulted with scholars who had translated Byzantine texts on the art of interrogation. This wasn't the crude brutality of a common torturer, but the calculated cruelty of someone who understood exactly how to dismantle a human soul piece by piece. The cages themselves were masterworks of engineered suffering. Each one was constructed with bars spaced precisely wide enough that the women could extend their arms through them, creating the illusion that escape might be possible while ensuring it never was. The floors were made of metal mesh that left painful impressions on their skin when they had tried to rest, making sleep nearly impossible. Most diabolically, the cages were positioned at different heights, creating a hierarchy of suffering that encouraged the women to compete for Vlad's attention and favor. The woman in the highest cage could look down on the others, creating a false sense of superiority that Vlad would exploit by occasionally offering her slightly better treatment. The woman in the lowest cage lived in constant fear that her position represented the greatest disfavor, though in reality Vlad's preferences changed daily based on nothing more than his whims. This arbitrary system of rewards and punishments kept all the prisoners off balance, never knowing what behavior might improve or worsen their situation. Temperature control was another weapon in Vlad's arsenal of torment. The underground chambers were deliberately kept at the edge of human endurance, cold enough to cause constant discomfort and weaken the women's resistance, but not so cold as to cause immediate death from exposure. In winter, the stone walls would become ice cold to the touch, forcing the prisoners to huddle against the metal bars for whatever warmth they could find. In summer, the chambers became stifling and airless, with no ventilation to provide relief from the oppressive heat. The feeding schedule was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the entire ordeal. Vlad had discovered that irregular feeding patterns caused more mental anguish than consistent starvation. Sometimes the women would go 3 days without food, only to receive a relatively generous meal that raised their hopes. Other times they would be fed small amounts daily for a week, establishing a routine that would then be broken without warning. This unpredictability prevented them from developing any sense of control over their situation and kept them in a constant state of anxious anticipation. The quality of the food itself was used as another form of communication and control. Fresh bread and clean water indicated approval, while moldy scraps and dirty water signaled displeasure. Sometimes Vlad would have elaborate meals prepared and brought down to the chambers, not to feed the prisoners, but to torture them with the smell of food they couldn't reach. The guards would eat these feasts in front of the cages, describing the flavors in detail while the starving women watched helplessly. Water deprivation was employed with even more precision than food restriction. The human body can survive much longer without food than without water, but the psychological impact of thirst is immediate and overwhelming. Vlad would sometimes allow the women to become desperately thirsty before providing just enough water to prevent serious medical complications. Other times, he would have buckets of fresh, clean water placed just outside their reach, close enough that they could see and smell it, but not close enough to drink. The lighting in the chambers was carefully controlled to maximize psychological distress. Complete darkness would have been merciful, allowing the women to lose track of time and perhaps find some peace in sleep. Instead, Vlad had oil lamps positioned to provide just enough illumination to make the women constantly aware of their surroundings, while casting eerie shadows that played tricks on their weakened minds. The lamps would sometimes be extinguished for days at a time, then suddenly relit without warning, disrupting any attempt to establish circadian rhythms or mental equilibrium. Sound was another tool of torture that Vlad employed with scientific precision. The chambers were designed with acoustic properties that amplified certain sounds while muffling others. The women could hear each other's suffering with crystal clarity, but their cries for help were muted before reaching the upper levels of the castle. This meant they were forced to listen to their fellow prisoners' anguish while knowing that their own pleas would go unheard by anyone who might help them. Vlad would sometimes have musicians play beautiful melodies in the corridors above the chambers, allowing fragments of song to drift down to the prisoners. This wasn't an act of kindness, but a deliberate reminder of the world they had lost, the world of beauty, culture, and human connection that existed just beyond their reach. The contrast between the sublime music and their horrific circumstances was designed to deepen their despair and make their current situation seem even more unbearable. The social dynamics among the prisoners became another source of entertainment for Vlad and a tool for their continued degradation. He would occasionally remove one woman from her cage and bring her upstairs for a bath, a proper meal, and a night in comfortable quarters. When she was returned to the chambers the next day, the other women would bombard her with questions about what she had experienced, what she had said to earn such treatment, and whether she had learned anything about their fate. These temporary reprieve created jealousy, suspicion, and desperate hope among the remaining prisoners. Some would assume that the chosen woman had betrayed them or revealed unflattering information about her fellow captives. Others would beg her to intercede on their behalf during any future encounters with their captor. The returned prisoner, meanwhile, would be tormented by guilt over her temporary comfort and fear that she had somehow doomed the others through her actions or words. Vlad understood that hunger and isolation would eventually break down the social barriers between women of different classes and backgrounds, creating opportunities for manipulation that wouldn't exist under normal circumstances. Noble ladies who had never spoken to anyone below their station would find themselves sharing intimate conversations with the daughters of minor lords or wealthy merchants. These bonds of shared suffering could have provided comfort and strength, but Vlad worked systematically to poison them with mistrust and competition. He would tell one prisoner that another had spoken ill of her family, or suggest that a third woman had claimed to be more worthy of marriage because of her superior breeding. None of these statements were true, but starving, terrified women in desperate circumstances were vulnerable to such manipulations. The resulting arguments and conflicts provided Vlad with hours of entertainment, while ensuring that the prisoners could never unite effectively against their common enemy. The religious faith that sustained many medieval women through hardship became another target for Vlad's psychological warfare. He would allow the women to pray together initially, even providing them with religious texts and holy relics. But as their imprisonment continued, he would begin removing these comforts one by one, claiming that their prayers were ineffective because God had abandoned them. He would question why a merciful deity would allow innocent women to suffer such torments, planting seeds of doubt that flourished in their weakened mental state. Some prisoners maintained their faith despite these challenges, finding strength in the belief that their suffering had divine purpose. Others experienced profound spiritual crises that left them questioning everything they had been taught about justice, mercy, and the nature of existence. Vlad seemed to take particular pleasure in watching devout women struggle with these theological dilemmas, often engaging them in philosophical discussions about the problem of evil and the silence of God in the face of human suffering. The physical effects of prolonged starvation were carefully monitored and documented by Vlad's personal physicians, who viewed the prisoners as subjects in a medical experiment. They recorded changes in the women's appearance, behavior, and mental capacity, creating detailed notes that Vlad studied with scholarly interest. He wanted to understand exactly how hunger affected the human mind and body, both for his own entertainment and for practical applications in future negotiations and conflicts. The doctors observed that the women's personalities underwent predictable changes as their ordeal continued. Initially defiant prisoners became increasingly submissive as their strength ebbed. Those who had maintained dignity and composure in the early weeks began exhibiting signs of mental breakdown after months of abuse. Some developed obsessive behaviors, counting the stones in the walls or arranging and rearranging their tattered clothing in ritualistic patterns that provided the illusion of control over their environment. Memory became unreliable as malnutrition affected the prisoners' cognitive abilities. Women who had arrived with sharp intellects and quick wit found themselves struggling to remember basic facts about their families or their lives before captivity. This mental deterioration was particularly devastating for those who had taken pride in their education and accomplishments, stripping away yet another aspect of their identity and self-worth. Sleep deprivation, whether caused by physical discomfort, hunger pangs, or psychological distress, compounded all the other effects of their imprisonment. The women would sometimes fall asleep standing up, only to be jolted awake when their legs gave out and they collapsed against the cage bars. Exhaustion made them more susceptible to Vlad's manipulations and less able to maintain the mental defenses that might have helped them endure their ordeal with greater dignity. Hallucinations became common as the weeks stretched into months. Some women reported seeing deceased family members or religious figures offering comfort and guidance. Others experienced terrifying visions of demons or monsters that seemed to emerge from the shadows of their cells. Vlad encouraged these reports, suggesting that the visions were signs of divine judgment or supernatural intervention that revealed the true character of each prisoner. The most insidious aspect of the entire system was how it forced the women to participate in their own degradation. To receive even the smallest mercy, an extra sip of water or a moment of warmer clothing, they had to demonstrate their submission and gratitude to their captor. They were required to thank him for his kindness, to praise his wisdom, and to express their unworthiness of his attention. These forced expressions of gratitude created cognitive dissonance that further undermined their psychological stability. Some women found themselves actually feeling grateful when Vlad showed them the smallest kindness, even though they intellectually understood that he was the source of all their suffering. This psychological phenomenon, which modern experts would recognize as a form of trauma bonding, created deep shame and confusion that persisted long after their release. They began to question their own perceptions and judgment, wondering if perhaps they deserved their treatment or if Vlad's actions were somehow justified. The isolation from the outside world was so complete that the women began to lose track of time entirely. Days blended into nights, weeks into months, until their previous lives seemed like distant dreams that might never have been real. Some prisoners began to doubt whether their families were actually searching for them, or if they had been forgotten and abandoned to their fate. Vlad encouraged these doubts by occasionally mentioning that certain families had stopped inquiring about their daughters, suggesting that they had given up hope or found more advantageous marriage prospects elsewhere. The most psychologically devastating moments came when Vlad would bring visitors to observe his collection. Foreign dignitaries, allied nobles, and even religious officials would descend into the chambers to witness what their host described as his method for ensuring the quality of his future bride. These observers would examine the prisoners like livestock at a market, commenting on their physical deterioration and speculating about their characters based on their current appearance. The women were forced to present themselves as appealingly as possible during these inspections, despite their starved and weakened condition. They had to smile, speak coherently when addressed, and demonstrate whatever grace and dignity they could muster while caged like animals. Failure to perform adequately during these visits could result in immediate punishment or extended imprisonment. So, the prisoners learned to summon reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. Some visitors expressed admiration for Vlad's innovative approach to matrimonial selection, praising his wisdom in testing potential wives under extreme conditions. Others seemed uncomfortable with what they witnessed, but were too politically dependent on Vlad's alliance to voice any objections. A few genuinely believed they were observing a legitimate test of character that would ultimately benefit both the women and their future husband by ensuring a successful marriage based on proven compatibility. The reactions of these visitors became another source of torment for the prisoners. When observers praised their composure or beauty, the women felt a flicker of hope that someone might intervene on their behalf. When visitors showed disgust or pity, the prisoners were reminded of how far they had fallen from their former status and dignity. Most crushing of all were the visitors who showed complete indifference, treating the women as mere curiosities rather than human beings deserving of compassion. Vlad took particular pleasure in hosting religious officials during these viewing sessions, challenging them to reconcile their beliefs about divine mercy with the suffering they witnessed. He would engage bishops and abbots in theological discussions about the nature of testing and purification, drawing parallels between his methods and biblical stories of trials and tribulation. Some clergy members were horrified by what they saw and attempted to intervene, but Vlad would dismiss their concerns by pointing out that God himself had tested Job's faith through suffering. The seasonal changes that marked the passage of time in the outside world became sources of additional psychological torture within the chambers. During winter, the women would shiver in their cages while Vlad described the warm fires and festive celebrations taking place in the castle above. In spring, he would bring flowers from the gardens and hold them just outside the cages, allowing the prisoners to smell the fragrance of the world they had lost. Summer brought reports of hunting parties and outdoor feasts, while autumn meant harvest celebrations that emphasized abundance in stark contrast to the women's perpetual hunger. These seasonal torments were designed to remind the prisoners of the natural world they were missing and the life cycles continuing without them. Vlad understood that humans are fundamentally connected to the rhythms of nature, and by cutting the women off from these patterns, he could deepen their sense of disconnection from their own humanity. The unchanging environment of the underground chambers created a timeless limbo that made their imprisonment feel eternal. The arrival of new prisoners created complex emotional responses among the existing captives. On one hand, newcomers brought news from the outside world and proof that life continued beyond the castle walls. They could provide updates about family members and political developments that helped the established prisoners maintain some connection to reality. On the other hand, new arrivals meant increased competition for Vlad's attention and the limited resources he provided. Veteran prisoners found themselves in the terrible position of wanting to warn newcomers about what awaited them, while also needing to protect their own chances of survival and eventual release. Some chose to remain silent, allowing new arrivals to discover the horror of their situation gradually. Others whispered warnings and advice, sharing survival strategies they had developed through bitter experience. A few, broken by their ordeal, actively collaborated with their captors by helping to deceive and manipulate the newcomers. The hierarchy that developed among the prisoners reflected both their original social standings and their adaptation to their current circumstances. Women from the most powerful families initially expected deference from those of lower birth, but prolonged suffering had a way of equalizing such distinctions. Some noble ladies discovered inner strength they never knew they possessed, while others collapsed under pressures they had never imagined facing. Meanwhile, women from more modest backgrounds sometimes proved more resilient, having faced hardships throughout their lives that better prepared them for extreme adversity. Vlad exploited these social dynamics by occasionally elevating prisoners from humble origins, while humiliating those of higher birth. He would suggest that true nobility was revealed through suffering rather than inherited through bloodlines, using the women's responses to these inversions of social order as another measure of their character. This created additional tension among the prisoners and prevented them from forming the unified resistance that might have threatened his control. The medical attention provided to the prisoners was carefully calibrated to maintain their health without alleviating their suffering. Physicians would treat serious injuries or illnesses that threatened their lives, but they would not provide pain relief or comfort measures that might make the experience more bearable. The women learned to hide minor ailments and injuries to avoid unwanted medical attention that often proved more traumatic than the original problems. Some prisoners developed eating disorders as a result of their prolonged starvation, becoming unable to consume normal amounts of food even when it was available. Others experienced lasting digestive problems that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The psychological trauma manifested in nightmares, anxiety attacks, and an inability to feel safe even in secure environments. Many survivors never fully recovered from their experiences, carrying the emotional scars of their imprisonment until their deaths. The documentation of these experiments was extensive and systematic, suggesting that Vlad viewed his activities as a form of scientific research rather than mere entertainment. His personal archives, discovered centuries later hidden within the castle walls, contained detailed observations about each prisoner's behavior, physical condition, and psychological state throughout their captivity. These records were written in a clinical style that treated the women as test subjects rather than human beings, referring to them by numbers rather than names and focusing on their responses to various stimuli and deprivations. The archives also revealed that Vlad had consulted with scholars from across Europe who shared his interest in human psychology and behavior under extreme conditions. He corresponded with physicians, philosophers, and even theologians about the theoretical aspects of his experiments, seeking to understand the fundamental nature of human character and the limits of physical and mental endurance. These intellectual pursuits provided a veneer of scholarly legitimacy that helped him rationalize his actions to himself and others. The castle staff who participated in these experiments were bound by oaths of secrecy that extended beyond Vlad's death, creating a conspiracy of silence that protected the truth for generations. Some servants were willing participants who shared their master's sadistic impulses, while others were coerced into compliance through threats against their own families. A few tried to help the prisoners in small ways, smuggling extra food or water when they could do so safely, but such acts of kindness were rare and dangerous. The economic cost of maintaining these elaborate torture chambers was enormous, requiring specialized construction, constant maintenance, and the services of numerous personnel. Vlad funded these expenses through increased taxation and tribute collection, essentially forcing his subjects to pay for the torture of innocent women. The irony was not lost on some contemporary observers who noted that a ruler claiming to test the worthiness of potential wives was bankrupting his own people to finance his perverse entertainments. The international diplomatic consequences of these activities were carefully managed through a combination of secrecy, misdirection, and strategic alliances. Vlad's agents worked tirelessly to suppress information about the true fate of the women, creating elaborate cover stories about extended courtship periods and careful consideration of marriage proposals. Foreign courts that might have objected to his methods were kept satisfied with regular reports about the progress of negotiations and the comfortable treatment their daughters were receiving. Some families eventually became suspicious when their daughters failed to return or send genuine correspondence, but their investigations were frustrated by the wall of silence surrounding the castle's activities. A few attempted to rescue their daughters through military action or diplomatic pressure, but these efforts were easily defeated by Vlad's superior resources and strategic position. The women's families found themselves trapped in a web of political considerations that made open confrontation impossible without risking war or economic devastation. The psychological impact on Vlad himself was profound, though he showed no outward signs of remorse or self-doubt. The systematic dehumanization of others inevitably affected his own humanity, making him increasingly isolated from normal human emotions and relationships. His ability to form genuine connections with other people atrophied through years of viewing them primarily as objects to be manipulated and controlled. Even his marriages to the women who survived his tests were hollow arrangements devoid of love, trust, or mutual respect. The legacy of these experiments extended far beyond the immediate victims to their families, communities, and future generations. Women throughout the region lived in fear of similar treatment, leading to changes in marriage customs and diplomatic practices that would persist for centuries. The psychological trauma experienced by the survivors was passed down through their children and grandchildren. creating patterns of dysfunction that affected entire family lines. The few women who survived their ordeal and lived to old age rarely spoke publicly about their experiences, carrying their secrets to the grave rather than reliving the trauma through testimony. Some found solace in religious life, dedicating themselves to prayer and charitable works that helped them find meaning in their suffering. Others withdrew from society entirely, unable to trust in human goodness after witnessing such calculated cruelty. A handful channeled their experiences into efforts to protect other women from similar fates, though their work was necessarily conducted in secret to avoid retaliation. The chambers themselves remained in use for decades after Vlad's death, as subsequent rulers found his methods too effective to abandon entirely. The infrastructure of torture he had created became a permanent feature of the castle, a ready-made system for breaking the will of anyone who challenged the established order. The cages were eventually discovered by historians in the 19th century, their purpose initially misunderstood until the archives were uncovered and translated. Today, the ruins of Poenari Castle stand as a monument to human cruelty, disguised as political necessity. The underground chambers have been sealed off from tourists, but their existence serves as a reminder that the darkest chapters of history often remain hidden beneath layers of official documentation and diplomatic fiction. The women who suffered and died in those iron cages deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to a tyrant's biography, but as individuals whose humanity was destroyed in service to one man's twisted vision of power and control. Their voices, silenced by fear and shame, still echo through the centuries, demanding that we acknowledge the true cost of absolute authority and the dangers that arise when human beings are reduced to objects in someone else's grand design. The cages may be empty now, but the questions they raise about power, cruelty, and the limits of human endurance remain as relevant today as they were 6 centuries ago. The story of Vlad Dracul's bride-testing chambers represents far more than the sadistic whims of a single medieval ruler. It reveals the systematic dehumanization that occurs when absolute power encounters no meaningful resistance, when political necessity becomes indistinguishable from personal cruelty, and when entire societies choose willful blindness over uncomfortable truths. What makes this tale particularly haunting is not just the individual suffering of the women trapped in those iron cages, but the elaborate network of complicity that made such horrors possible. Every servant who delivered the meager rations, every guard who ignored the desperate pleas, every diplomat who perpetuated the fiction of normal courtship negotiations, all became participants in a machinery of cruelty that extended far beyond the castle walls. The physicians who monitored the women's deterioration while refusing to provide meaningful relief, the craftsmen who designed specialized instruments of torment, the scribes who documented each stage of psychological breakdown. These were not monsters born of some alien evil, but ordinary people who had learned to rationalize the unthinkable through gradual exposure and institutional pressure. They began with small compromises, minor ethical violations that seemed justifiable under the circumstances, until they found themselves maintaining a system that would have horrified their younger, more innocent selves. The international community's response reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire affair. Foreign courts knew something was wrong. Too many daughters disappeared. Too many marriage negotiations stretched on indefinitely. Too many rumors circulated among the diplomatic corps. But the political benefits of maintaining relationships with Vlad outweighed their moral concerns about the welfare of women they had never met and would never have to face. This willful ignorance created a bubble of deniability that protected everyone involved from having to confront the reality of what they were enabling. Ambassadors could report back to their monarchs that negotiations were proceeding normally. Families could comfort themselves with official assurances about their daughters' well-being, and allied rulers could continue their profitable relationships without acknowledging the blood upon which they were built. The women themselves became ghosts long before they died, erased from official records and public memory while they still drew breath. Their names disappeared from court documents, their portraits were removed from family galleries, and their very existence became an inconvenient truth that everyone agreed to forget. They were transformed from individuals with hopes, dreams, and personalities into statistical entries in Vlad's experimental records. data points in a study of human endurance that treated suffering as a scholarly pursuit. Perhaps most tragically, some of the survivors internalized the logic of their captivity so completely that they never fully escaped even after their physical release. They had been broken so systematically that they continued to believe, on some level, that their treatment had been justified, that they had indeed been tested and found wanting, that their suffering had revealed fundamental flaws in their character that made them unworthy of better treatment. This psychological colonization extended beyond the individual victims to influence entire generations of women who learned to accept diminished expectations and constrained possibilities as natural and proper. The message sent by Vlad's experiments echoed across centuries. Women existed primarily as objects to be evaluated and used, their worth determined entirely by their ability to satisfy male desires and requirements, their suffering irrelevant except as it served larger political purposes. The technical innovations developed for these torture chambers found their way into other applications, spreading like a virus through the medieval world as rulers shared knowledge about effective methods of control and intimidation. The architectural features, the psychological techniques, the systematic approaches to breaking human will all became part of a growing body of expertise that treated cruelty as a science worthy of serious study and continuous refinement. The religious justifications developed to rationalize these activities proved equally durable and influential. The notion that suffering revealed character, that extreme testing was necessary to determine worthiness, that divine will could be discerned through observing human responses to torment. These ideas provided theological cover for countless future atrocities committed by those who learned to dress their sadism in the language of spiritual necessity. The economic systems that funded these elaborate cruelties created their own momentum as entire industries developed around the infrastructure of systematic abuse. Craftsmen specialized in creating instruments of confinement. Physicians studied the effects of controlled starvation. Architects designed spaces optimized for psychological torture. These professional developments normalized activities that should have remained unthinkable, transforming them into routine technical challenges to be solved through expertise and innovation. The legal frameworks that protected these activities from interference established precedents that would influence jurisprudence for centuries. The principle that rulers possessed absolute authority over their subjects' bodies and minds, the notion that diplomatic immunity extended to protecting any activities conducted within sovereign territory, the idea that political necessity justified any means. These concepts became embedded in the foundations of international law and continue to shape global politics today. The children born to the few women who survived their ordeals carried genetic and psychological legacies of trauma that would influence their own offspring in turn. The stress hormones generated by extreme fear and starvation, the neurological changes caused by prolonged abuse, the behavioral patterns developed as survival mechanisms, all became part of an inheritance passed down through generations, ensuring that Vlad's cruelty would continue to inflict damage long after his death. The castle itself became a kind of infection that spread its influence throughout the surrounding region. Other rulers, impressed by Vlad's methods and results, began implementing similar systems within their own territories. The techniques and technologies developed at Poenari became templates that were copied, modified, and improved upon by subsequent generations of tyrants who learned to industrialize human suffering with ever greater efficiency. The silence that protected these activities created a culture of complicity that extended far beyond those directly involved in their implementation. Entire populations learned to avert their eyes from obvious signs of systematic abuse, to accept implausible official explanations for disturbing phenomena, to prioritize their own safety and comfort over the welfare of distant victims whose suffering remained conveniently invisible. This collective amnesia became a survival mechanism for societies that could not bear to acknowledge the full extent of the horrors committed in their name. The psychological burden of recognizing their complicity in such systematic cruelty would have been unbearable. So they chose instead to construct elaborate fictions that allowed them to maintain their self-image as decent, moral people while enabling the continuation of activities that contradicted every principle they claimed to hold sacred. The documentation that survived provides us with a window into the bureaucracy of evil, revealing how systematic cruelty requires careful planning, detailed record keeping, and institutional support to achieve its full potential. The meticulous notes kept by Vlad's physicians, the architectural drawings of the torture chambers, the correspondence with foreign scholars interested in his methods, all demonstrate that these were not crimes of passion or moments of temporary madness, but carefully calculated programs designed to achieve specific objectives through the systematic destruction of human dignity. The women who died in those iron cages deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a historical curiosity, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by a system that viewed their suffering as entertainment and their deaths as acceptable losses in pursuit of larger goals. Their names may be lost to history, but their experience represents countless others who have faced similar fates throughout human history. Whenever power encounters no meaningful constraints and cruelty becomes indistinguishable from policy. The iron cages of Poenari Castle stand empty now, but the mentality that created them persists in new forms, adapted to contemporary circumstances but driven by the same fundamental disregard for human dignity that characterized Vlad's medieval experiments. The challenge for every generation is to recognize these patterns before they become normalized, to resist the gradual erosion of moral boundaries that makes the unthinkable seem reasonable, and to remember that behind every system of oppression are individual human beings whose suffering matters regardless of its political utility. The echoes of those desperate cries still reverberate through time, reminding us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against those who would reduce other human beings to objects in their grand designs. The women of Poenari paid that price with their lives, leaving behind a legacy written in blood and tears that demands we never forget the capacity for evil that lies dormant within every human heart, waiting only for the right circumstances to awaken and consume everything in its path.